The email hit Ethan Harper's inbox at 8:47 a.m. on a Thursday, 3 days into the first real break he'd taken in 5 years. He was halfway up a narrow trail in the Mendocino Coast redwoods, boots crunching on damp pine needles, the Pacific fog curling around the trunks like it was trying to hide something. His phone vibrated once, sharp and insistent against his thigh. He almost ignored it. Almost. But that little buzz had a way of pulling him back. Even out here where cell service flickered like a bad memory. Ethan had spent weeks preparing for this trip. Not just packing, he'd built spreadsheets for the handover. Color-coded every open compliance file at Nexus Dynamics, the fintech startup in San Francisco where he'd been the quiet backbone for half a decade. He was the guy who made sure contracts didn't explode, who caught regulatory landmines before they blew up in the boardroom. No flashy title, no corner office, just steady competence that kept the chaos at bay. His boss had signed off on the 2-week vacation with the usual corporate smile. "You deserve it, Ethan. We'll hold down the fort." The words had felt hollow even then, like they were reading from a script. He'd left detailed notes, escalation paths, key contacts, even contingency plans if the SEC came knocking. On his last day, he'd sat in the dim office light, double-checking the encrypted drive labeled Transition Protocol. A colleague from finance. I've known Ethan since the early days when Nexus was still scrambling for series, had joked that he was prepping like the apocalypse was coming. He'd given me that faint, tired half-smile and said, "Better safe. Companies forget fast." I didn't realize how prophetic that was. Now, deep in the woods, he stopped on the trail, pulled out his phone, and saw the message from HR. "Hey, Ethan. Quick favor, can you review the Q3 audit templates? The auditors are pushing hard, and you're the expert. Team player move." It was signed with the usual emoji. That fake cheer that always made requests sound optional when they weren't. No, hope you're enjoying your time off. No acknowledgement that he'd been drowning in audits and executive panic for years. Just the ask. Ethan stared at the screen for a long moment. The fog thickened around him, muting the world. His thumb hovered. He knew the policy inside out. He'd helped draft the core employee handbook 3 years earlier during one of the company's frantic growth spurts. Nexus had hired aggressively, onboarding dozens without standardized contracts, pasting together old templates and hoping nothing cracked. Ethan had stepped in quietly, late nights in his gray hoodie, building structured clauses for performance, arbitration, and leave protections. Most people skimmed them. He made sure they were airtight. He typed back carefully. Per Company Policy 4.2 and Federal Protected Leave Guidelines, I am currently on approved, uninterrupted vacation. I do not consent to perform any work-related tasks at this time. Please direct requests to the designated backup contacts provided in my handover documentation. Professional. Precise. No anger. No extra words. He hit send, pocketed the phone, and kept walking. The trail opened to a viewpoint overlooking the gray ocean, waves crashing far below. For the first time in years, his shoulders eased a fraction. 15 minutes later, the second buzz came. This one was different. Subject line: termination notice, effective immediately. The body was clinical, cold, due to noncompliance with urgent business needs during your approved leave period. Your employment with Nexus Dynamics is terminated effective immediately. Severance benefits are revoked pursuant to policy. No call. No discussion. Just a digital blade. Ethan read it twice, the wind whipping at his jacket. He took a screenshot instinctively, evidence first, reaction later. That was his training. I didn't hear from him right away. It was hours before he forwarded me the chain with a single-word subject. Noted. When we spoke later, his voice was steady, almost philosophical. They waited until day 3 to make it stick as abandonment. Smart move on paper. But they forgot something. He didn't elaborate then. He didn't need to. Ethan had always been the invisible architect. In those frantic early days when Nexus was burning through cash and scaling like a wildfire, he'd written safeguards no one paid attention to. One clause in particular, buried in the standard employment agreements. Only 19 words. Termination during approved protected leave shall trigger maximum statutory severance multiplier, full legal indemnity coverage, and mandatory regulatory compliance disclosure unless resolved privately within 72 hours. He'd added it half in grim humor, half as quiet insurance after watching executives steamroll junior staff and rewrite rules on the fly. Nobody questioned it. Legal skimmed,
nodded, moved on.
Ethan had never planned to use it.
But now,
standing on that cliff, the ocean indifferent below, he felt the first real shift. Not rage, not triumph, just the slow recognition that the machine had tripped its own wire. He didn't call anyone immediately. Instead, he found a flat rock,
sat down,
and watched the fog roll in thicker. His mind drifted back to the boardroom 3 years ago, the half-eaten takeout, the panicked arguments over burn rates, the founders sweating through their hoodies while legal was absent. He'd volunteered to standardize everything. No glory sought. Just Ethan, precise and unassuming, typing late while marketing argued about branding 2 doors down. That clause was his subtle pushback against the carelessness. A loaded safeguard no one saw coming. Back in San Francisco, the office was already humming with unease. Slack channels lit up subtly at first. Anyone else get weird HR pings? Then the termination notice leaked internally, somehow screenshotted, whispered. I watched colleagues exchange glances during stand-up. Ethan's absence, once a planned relief, now felt like the first crack in the foundation. The CFO's team started quietly reviewing contracts. No one said his name yet, but the tension built like pressure before a storm. Ethan spent the rest of that afternoon hiking further, phone on airplane mode after the initial flurry. He found a secluded campsite, pitched his tent methodically, and built a small fire as dusk settled. The flames danced against the redwoods. He poured a small measure of bourbon from his flask, his one indulgence, and let the events replay. The interruption, the refusal, the swift acts. It wasn't personal to them. He knew. Just business. But the clause made it deeply personal now. As night fell, his phone, back on briefly, lit up with missed calls from unknown numbers tied to executive extensions. He let them go to voicemail. One from the general counsel. Ethan, we should talk about this misunderstanding. He listened once, then deleted. The wind picked up, carrying the distant roar of waves. In that moment, alone with the trees and the dark, Ethan felt something release, not the vacation relaxation he'd planned, but a deeper unburdening. Years of plugging leaks, covering mistakes, being indispensable without reward. Now the rules he'd written were speaking for him. The next morning brought more. An email from legal counsel. Sharper. Request immediate discussion regarding resolution options. No apology. Still the corporate tone. Ethan read it over coffee brewed on his camp stove, the steam rising in the cool air. He didn't reply. Instead, he packed up and continued north along the coast, the trail winding through wildflowers and sea mist. His steps were deliberate, unhurried. The company was unraveling in the background, but out here, time slowed to the rhythm of the ocean. I got another message from him around noon, a photo of the sea stack rocks jutting from the surf. Caption simply, still here. No mention of the firing. But I knew him well enough to sense the undercurrent, the quiet calculation beneath the calm. Nexus Dynamics had made a mistake. They'd assumed he'd be too stunned, too disconnected to push back. They didn't remember who had written the foundational policies during their most vulnerable phase. Ethan had. By evening of day 4, the internal panic was palpable even from afar. I heard through the grapevine that the executive sync had gone off the rails. Uninvited legal presence. Hushed voices. Papers shuffling. The general counsel, a sharp woman named Rebecca Voss, had read the clause aloud in a closed meeting. Termination during protected leave triggers maximum multiplier plus indemnity and potential public disclosure. The room had gone still. The CEO, mid-sip of his oat milk latte, had frozen. Someone muttered about regulatory filings. The weight hit them all at once. Ethan's work. Now, a weapon aimed back at the heart of the company. Slack threads buzzed with speculation. Junior analysts dug into archived contracts. Finance accidentally CC'd the wrong thread, spreading details further. Investors started circling with cautious inquiries. Any unresolved compliance triggers we should know about? The machine that had discarded Ethan so casually was now choking on its own rules. Ethan, meanwhile, reached a quiet overlook at sunset. He sat on the edge, legs dangling, the sky bleeding orange into the sea. His phone showed a dozen unread messages. He glanced, nodded to himself, and set it aside. No rush. The clause had its own momentum now. Gravity would do the rest. The fog thickened again, wrapping the coast in mystery, mirroring the uncertainty back at headquarters. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself a small, private smile, not vengeful, but satisfied in the precision of it all. The company had written its own fate when they ignored the very protections they'd signed. The board convened an emergency closed session the following afternoon, off-calendar and tightly controlled. Phones surrendered at the door. Assistants excluded. Rebecca Voss stood at the front of the sleek conference room in the Nexus headquarters, holding a printed copy of Ethan's employment agreement. No slides. No pleasantries. She highlighted the clause in yellow and read it slowly. Any termination executed during an approved protected leave period shall automatically trigger the maximum severance multiplier as defined in Section 7C. Full legal indemnity for related claims. And activation of mandatory regulatory compliance disclosure protocols if not resolved privately within 72 hours. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. The CFO shifted uncomfortably. The VP of Operations, usually the loudest voice in the room, stared at the table like it held answers. The CEO, Daniel Park, gripped his mug tighter, the ceramic warming under his palms. How enforceable is this? Someone finally asked. Rebecca didn't hesitate. Fully. It aligns with both our internal handbook and federal guidelines on protected leave. The termination notice explicitly cited refusal during leave as cause. There's no ambiguity. HR tried to defend the decision, citing urgent business needs, but Rebecca cut through. Your department issued the notice. The language is direct. Non-compliance. It's already screenshotted internally. This isn't salvageable without immediate remediation. Panic didn't erupt. It seeped in whispers. Executives texted under the table. The intern handling notes dropped his pen. Outside the room, the company floor felt the ripple, locked Slack channels, restricted drive edits. People walking quieter, as if the walls had ears. Ethan remained unreachable in the best way. He spent the day exploring tide pools along the Mendocino shore, the cold water shocking his hands as he turned over rocks to watch anemones and crabs. His mind wandered to the early days at Nexus, when the startup vibe masked the recklessness. They'd hired fast, burned brighter, but contracts were patchwork. He'd volunteered for the standardization project because no one else would. Late nights, coffee going cold, building clauses that protected the vulnerable while the founders chased valuations. Clause 7C had been a quiet addition, born from watching a colleague get quietly sidelined during parental leave. No one noticed the 19 words. Until now. By late afternoon, Rebecca's team drafted a settlement packet. They engaged an external investigator, former federal regulator turned corporate fixer, to review communications logs. The Slack exports from Ethan's last days showed the pattern. Handover completed. Vacation approved. Then the intrusive request. No mutual agreement to interrupt. The investigator's report landed blunt. High risk of successful claim. Potential public filing exposing termination reasoning. The CEO emerged from his office, looking drained. Gray circles under his eyes. He approved the courier delivery of the revised agreement that evening. The envelope arrived at Ethan's designated address. But since he was off-grid, it waited. Meanwhile, Ethan cooked a simple meal over his camp stove, pasta with foraged herbs, and ate watching the stars emerge. His phone stayed mostly silent now. Notifications muted. One message slipped through from me. Office is tense. They know about the clause. He replied hours later. Let it play out. The next morning brought escalation. An angel investor emailed Daniel directly. Confirm no open contractual disputes or regulatory triggers with recent terminations. The phrasing was polite but carried weight. Capital could vanish fast.
That pushed the timeline.
Rebecca reached out again via email. Ethan. Urgent need to discuss resolution. Available for call? Still no reply. The 72-hour window loomed. Internally, gossip accelerated. Recruiters whispered on LinkedIn about unstable exit protocols. Clients probed during calls. The compliance team started auditing every active contract, fearing similar hidden safeguards. Ethan's quiet legacy suddenly loomed large. The man they deemed disposable was the one who'd built the rails they ran on. Ethan hiked to a lighthouse overlook that day, the wind whipping his hair, salt spray on his face. He thought about the human cost. Not just his colleagues who'd been overworked, the quiet resentment building in the ranks. The clause wasn't revenge, it was alignment. The company had broken its own promise of protected time. He was simply enforcing what they'd agreed to in writing. As the sun climbed higher, he felt the emotional weight lift further. Years of being the fixer, the one who stayed late, now balanced by this unforeseen justice. Back at headquarters, the board authorized the maximum payout under the multiplier, triple the standard severance, plus indemnity covering estimated legal exposure. The numbers climbed into 7 figures when including potential disclosure risks. Daniel signed the acknowledgement himself, adding a handwritten note at the bottom. This was handled poorly. My responsibility. Apologies. The packet was prepped for courier. The courier arrived at Ethan's home address on the 5th day. But he didn't return until late that evening. He opened the thick envelope with a butter knife at his kitchen table. The house quiet except for the distant city hum. Inside, notarized agreement. Detailed payment breakdown. Formal admission that the termination violated protected leave provisions. The language was stripped bare, no euphemisms. Violation acknowledged. Maximum multiplier applied. Indemnity provided. The CEO's handwritten line sat there, raw amid the corporate formatting. Ethan read it slowly, the kitchen light casting long shadows. No surge of anger. No gloating. Just a measured acceptance. He drafted a brief reply email, subject, clause enforcement. Body, thank you for the acknowledgement and resolution per policy. Payment accepted. No further correspondence required. Sent at 11:12 p.m. Then he poured a glass of water, sat on his couch, and let the reality settle. The money would clear in days. The public disclosure threat had forced their hand. Word spread internally by morning. The executive sync acknowledged revisions to exit protocols without naming Ethan. But everyone knew. Other departments quietly reviewed their templates. Startups in the Valley started inquiring who had authored Nexus's framework. HR consultants flagged similar clauses elsewhere. The ripple was becoming doctrine, companies suddenly more cautious about interrupting leave. Ethan didn't monitor it closely. He returned to the coast for the remaining days. The payout a distant fact. He walked beaches, read paperbacks under the sun, let the tide wash over his feet. One afternoon, a seagull boldly stole part of his lunch. He laughed out loud for the first time in weeks. The sound carrying over the waves. A text from finance colleague Claire. They rewrote severance language company-wide today. Your clause started the chain reaction. He read it, locked the phone, and watched the bird fly off. The resolution carried a moral weight. Ethan had never sued, never leaked, never sought public vindication. He'd let the policy speak. The company had tried to erase him efficiently, treating protected time as optional. Their own words undid them. In the quiet evenings, Ethan reflected on the human element, the executives sweating in boardrooms, the interns caught in crossfire, the broader culture that valued speed over safeguards. His clause had exposed the fragility. I met him for coffee after his return. He looked rested, eyes clearer. It wasn't about winning, he said softly. It was about the rules applying equally. They forgot that part. The payout had restored balance. But the real shift was internal. Nexus revised policies, added safeguards against retaliatory terminations. But trust had cracked. Employees whispered more, watched their backs. Weeks later, during an investor call buried on the company site, Daniel stumbled through prepared remarks about strengthened leadership protocols. His eyes carried the exhaustion of fallout. No mention of Ethan. But the subtext was clear. The clause had forced accountability without courtroom drama. Ethan updated his planner with one line, balance restored. He didn't post online, didn't gloat. The story stayed contained, but its lesson echoed. Meticulous, quiet competence could outlast corporate haste. The Mendocino fog had cleared for him, leaving clearer skies. Yet the question lingered for those who knew. How many other hidden clauses waited in forgotten documents, ready to remind companies of their own promises? The full payout cleared Ethan's account 10 days post-resolution. He transferred portions to savings, a modest charity for worker rights advocacy, and kept enough for a longer future break. No lavish spending. The precision that defined his career extended to finances. Colleagues noticed his return was understated. He resumed at a new role elsewhere. But the Valley rumor mill carried the tale of the ghost clause at Nexus. Inside Nexus, the aftermath was structural. Compliance audits intensified. New hires received extra training on leave policies. Rebecca Voss presented updated handbooks to the board, emphasizing proactive protections. The VP of HR faced internal scrutiny. Her department's hasty termination letter now a cautionary example. Daniel's handwritten apology circulated in quiet circles, humanizing the CEO but underscoring the misstep. Ethan spent time reconnecting with personal life neglected during the grind, hikes with friends, reading philosophy, even volunteering locally. The emotional arc completed slowly, from the initial gut punch of betrayal to acceptance that systems could self-correct when forced by their own logic. The conflict wasn't just legal, it was psychological, corporate identity versus individual dignity. I watched from my desk as Slack settled, but underlying unease persisted. Devs referenced Ethan's clause in jokes that weren't entirely jokes. Finance ran scenarios on indemnity triggers. The story became internal legend, teaching newer employees that invisible roles held unexpected power. Ethan avoided interviews or tell-alls. When asked privately, he said simply, "I followed the policy they approved." The message was clear: respect the rules you set, or they may enforce themselves harshly. The moral lingered. In America's cutthroat tech scene, where growth often trampled process, one man's meticulous foresight had recalibrated the scales. The company's stock dipped slightly on vague compliance news, recovering as reforms were announced. Investors appreciated the transparency post-crisis. But the human cost remained: strained relationships, lost talent momentum, a board more wary. Ethan's final reflection came on a quiet evening walk near his apartment, city lights reflecting on the bay. The ocean from his vacation echoed in memory. He whispered to himself, almost inaudible. Their rules spoke louder. No bitterness, just closure. The clause had done its job, not as vengeance, but as justice quietly served. Colleagues like me wondered, how many Ethans existed in other firms? With similar unseen protections waiting, Nexus moved forward, revised and chastened. But the M-on remained. One overlooked paragraph had nearly exposed everything. The question of corporate ethics hung. Were they learning? Or just patching the wound? Ethan didn't need the answer. He'd moved on. The weight lifted, leaving behind a story of precision triumphing over haste. In the months following, the incident reshaped perceptions at Nexus. Training sessions highlighted protected leave as inviolable. Exit interviews probed deeper for compliance concerns. Ethan's departure, once a footnote, became a pivotal case study in internal workshops, anonymous, of course, but details recognizable to those involved. For Ethan, life post-Nexus was measured renewal. He consulted part-time for smaller firms, emphasizing thorough contract reviews. Friends noticed a subtle confidence, the satisfaction of alignment without aggression. No public revenge narrative emerged. Instead, quiet integrity defined his path. The broader valley took note indirectly. Similar stories surfaced, clauses triggering payouts, companies revising hastily. Ethan's case, though contained, influenced best practices subtly. Legal blogs referenced Nexus-style triggers without naming, advising caution on leave interruptions. Emotionally, Ethan processed layers: initial shock on the trail, calculated restraint, eventual peace, watching tides. The mouth-thwan between corporate expediency and human need resolved in his favor through foresight. It raised lingering questions. How often do overlooked policies protect the vulnerable? What ethical duty do drafters hold when embedding safeguards? I last spoke with Ethan over drinks months later. He reflected, I didn't plan the explosion. I just ensured the fuse existed if they stepped on it. The company had paid, reformed minimally, and continued. But the human element endured. The executives' panic. The interns dropped papers. The CEO's apology note. These moments humanized the machine, reminding that behind policies were people making choices with consequences. The story ends not with triumph, but reflection. Ethan enjoyed a longer trip later that year. Phone truly off. The ocean remained indifferent, but for him, balance was restored. Companies like Nexus would always chase growth, but perhaps with a bit more caution now. The clause's legacy was a whisper: respect the fine print, or it may whisper back loudly. In America's relentless corporate landscape, Ethan's quiet stand left an on justice through precision, without the need for screams. What hidden protections lie in your contracts? The question lingers for anyone who's ever felt indispensable yet disposable.